This video we're going to look at some basics about risk. So first of all, what is risk? Several definitions: effective uncertainty on objectives. That's from the standard that we'll look at in a minute. Another definition is an uncertain event that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on the project objectives. That's from PMBOK. So let's look at some of those words. Event is something that happens. Positive or negative effect means, well, the effect means a deviation from the unexpected. You didn't expect that to happen. So the event happens and it causes an effect, the results of that. It can be positive or negative, it can be good or bad. So in other words, you might have allowed 4 weeks to do some earthworks and it rains for 2 of those weeks. So now it's going to take you 5 weeks to do the earthworks, or 6 weeks. Now that's a negative. The event there is it rained more than you anticipated, and the effect is that it's going to take you longer to do that earthworks work package. On the other hand, in that 4 weeks you might have allowed 1 week for rain, and it doesn't rain. So the event there is it doesn't rain as expected, and therefore you finish the work in 3 weeks and you are a week ahead. So that's a positive effect. Another word there is uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is a state of deficiency of information, understanding, or likelihood. In other words, you don't know when you're planning the project in December if it's going to rain in February. You don't know what days it's going to rain on. You don't know how long it's going to rain. You don't know what you don't know the details. You know it probably will rain, but you don't have much detail on it. So that's what they mean by uncertainty. And objectives, we looked at that before. What do you wish to achieve? So obviously when it rains and your earthworks work package extends out longer than what you thought, then that is starting to reduce the chances of you being able to bring the project in on time. It's going to cost you more as well, so it affects your budget as well. So that's affecting a couple of those objectives that we sort of talked about in the previous video. So the more uncertainty there is, the more risk. And projects are unique, which means that we don't know, we haven't done a lot of this stuff before. So there's more uncertainty and, once again, more risk. Now, civil engineering projects are more so than most other types of projects. For example, and the reason for that is we are working over large areas of land. We are working in soils that are materials that we laid down, millions of years ago. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like below the soil. We're working outside. We're working in the middle of community, so there are people around our community. So there is obviously safety issues. People might wander onto your site, so that's affecting your objective of doing the work safely, and you have to do something about that. We're exposed to the weather, so it can rain. We're exposed to flooding. Now, for example, if you were looking at, say, an electrical project where they're putting together a switchboard, they would be working in a factory. They would be in a commercial area without any members of the public sort of wandering around. They are not affected by the rain because they're working in a nice big workshop. So other types of engineering, even engineering projects, aren't as risky or as engineering projects, civil engineering projects, because civil engineering has more uncertainty associated with it. Let's look at a few of those definitions in a little bit more detail. Event is also known as a trigger event. It's something that happens that affects the project objective. So it could be it rains more than what you thought. The fact that it rains is something that's not really an event, it's going to rain, but it rains more than what you thought it might be. A member of the public wanders on to the site is another event. So the threat is an event that adversely affects the project objective. So excessive rain is a threat. If it doesn't rain, then there's an opportunity there for you to actually do the work quicker than what you did before. So that's the other side of the coin, if you like, events that positively affects the project objectives. And the last concept I want you to take on board is risk tolerance. Now this is the organisation that you work for, as a consultant or a contractor, or the client's risk tolerance as well. So that's the degree of risk that an organisation will take. So, for example, if you're talking about some organisations that don't want to take any risk at all with their money, they say we don't want, we want a set price and we don't want it to run over. So they will actually go for a fixed price contract, which might cost them a little bit more, but there's very little risk of it running over. Whereas other organisations might say, oh well, we'll take the risk if we strike bad ground conditions or something like that, then we'll take the risk that we have to pay more than what we would have otherwise. So the degree of risk that an organisation will take also governs um, how you manage risk on that particular project. So an acceptable level of risk is, like I said, risk tolerance is how much risk the client will accept for each project objective. They may accept a time overrun, but they might not accept a budget overrun. So that's the other thing about risk tolerances. Some of those objectives they're willing to compromise, and some of them they're not. So that harks back to when we were looking at ranking our objectives. You know, what is the most important objective? So you don't really want to be taking risks with the top objectives. So in a construction project, it might be quality and scope, but you might be willing to run over time. So you're willing to compromise that objective. So each one of those different people building their house, so people building their own house, they probably don't have much money, so they don't want it to run over budget, so they're probably willing to let it run over time. Building a stadium for a World Cup, obviously it has to finish a few weeks before at least then the World Cup starts, otherwise it doesn't do its objective. So time would be the overriding um, objective for that one, and they don't want to take any risks on running over time. And building a bridge over a high value wetland, once again there's an environmental, so the protection of the environment would be your prime objective there, and you don't want to risk that objective at all. So it would mean that you might spend more time putting in um, protection measures. You might do construction methodologies that take more time and cost more by building everything at a remote site, then trucking it in and just dropping the bridge into site rather than building it above the wetland. So those are the sort of decisions that affect how you plan the project, because you've sort of got to look at the risks and what is important to you and what's not important to you. Now, over the time cycle of a life cycle of a project, there are a number of risks that reduce as the project progresses, because remember, risk is all about uncertainty. So as you're building it, you are finding out more about the project. When you've done the earthworks, you know how much rain you're going to get. So during the planning, you need to understand the requirements and develop accurate estimates. So it's really important during the planning stages to really nail those things, to understand exactly what you're going to do, because there is a risk that you don't understand the requirements and you plan the project to do something different from what was required. During the execution, it's, do you get the right people? Do they perform as you require them to do? Are there scope changes? So those are the main uncertainties that happen there. And during testing, during closure, is the client going to accept it? Does the handover work? Does the handover provide the client with the information and skills they need to actually run the facility once you've handed it over? Right. So risk management is quite an important part of project management. In fact, risk management is a very important part of most types of management. Some people say that that most management is just risk management. It is identifying what you want to do, what your objectives are, what's going to stop you, and then putting systems in place that are going to stop those things from happening or minimize their effects. Now, there is a standard for writing risk management plans for companies. So companies normally have risk management systems, and AS, Australian Standard / New Zealand Standard 31000 sets out a system, the principles and guidelines for a risk management process. And it's based on an international standard. That's why it's got that 31000, which is a bit different from most New Zealand standards. So it's ISO 9000 as well. So you'll probably, sorry, ISO 31000. So you'll probably find something like that over in Europe or England as well. It's a process is similar to PMBOK, and you can actually go onto the Unitech site and download that, and it's well worth you doing it. Now for this course, we're going to use the NZS 31000 words, if you like, um, yeah, the statements of each one of them. But each one of those correlates with a PMBOK step, if you like. So establishing the context, which we're going to look at in a minute, is plan risk management. Risk identification, identify risks. So if you look at those project management processes, you'll see that those PMBOK ones are actually there. So all that NZS 31000 does is it's the same processes, but PMBOK just gives them a different set of names. So it's worthwhile, we're going to use these titles here, but it's worthwhile remembering that they have, they're the same as ones that occur in PMBOK.